Hi guys, Ross here and welcome back to another video. So in today's video I'm going to be showing you how I created this label using Cinema 4D and Redshift. We're going to be talking about how to set up the different embossings, different finishes, how to get the realistic paper texture, but also a few tips and tricks on lighting your scene and really getting the most out of your label. So without further ado, let's jump straight into this project and show you how to set up one of these labels. So we're in Cinema 4D and I'm just going to lock the render view so I can jump out of the camera really quickly. And you can see this is the setup for this project. We've got a bunch of different lights going on which are all doing slightly different things. Some of them are really helping to kind of showcase these different finishes, while some are just acting as kind of key lights for the label. I'm going to go through these a little bit later, but I do just want to dive straight into the label and kind of get stuck into the nitty and gritty. So let's jump into our label material we have here and have a look at how this is set up. Now, depending on your experience with Redshift, this may look fairly simple to you, or it may look pretty complex, but I'm going to break it down either way, and hopefully you guys find something useful in it. But first off, I want to talk about my kind of approach to a project like this, or setting up a label like this with different embossings and different finishes. So this is actually a client project, and when they came to me, they said, okay, we want this label. It's going to have this slightly rough card paper texture to it. It's going to have an embossing on the logo, and it's also going to have a nice UV glossy finish on the water droplet. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, we need to create the base label, which is going to have no finishes, just going to be used to get that really nice paper texture and just get the reflection, the roughness at the right amount. And then we need to create a material for the logo where it says O Water, which is going to be the embossed glossy finish. And then we also need to create another material for the embossed glossy water droplet. So that's 3 materials, which you can see here in this material setup. So we have the base label here. So if I plug this into the surface, I have a shortcut set to Shift Q, but you can go up to Tools and connect node to output. So if I have this selected, press Shift Q, it's going to connect it straight to the surface, which is really handy when I want to see a specific node. So for example, here is just the plain label. You can see we have no finishes, and this is being plugged into the diffuse color of this material. So this is the base label material. You can see we have no finishes. It's literally just a label. Now there is a little bit of detail which we've already dialed in. If I go to fixed scaling on the render view and start to zoom in, and then let's just set a render region so it renders a bit quicker, you can see that we're already getting a little bit of that paper texture come through, and I'm going to show you guys how to set that up really quickly. So let's start to isolate these textures. We have plugged in the diffuse label, and this is just the artwork they supplied to me. You can see in Photoshop here we have a flat artwork which they actually supplied to me in Illustrator, but I've brought into Photoshop, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that is the flat artwork, and you can see we're getting no reflection, no paper texture, nothing, just a very simple artwork in there essentially. So what we're going to start to do is actually dial in some of that paper texture. So I'm using a paper texture from ccotextures.com. If I just zoom out, this is what it looks like when it's kind of wrapped onto the label. And this can be found here, ccotextures.com, paper 001. Because it's under the Creative Commons license, it means you can use it for personal, commercial, basically any type of work that you would like to. So we've loaded in that texture, and it actually comes with the roughness map. It will come with a diffuse map and a normal map, and we want to use the roughness map, which is basically going to allow us to control the texture of the reflections. So this is the default texture. I've then ran it through a triplanar node, which we probably didn't really need to use, but basically it's going to allow us to make it a little bit smaller. So you can see it's kind of shrunk down that texture, and it's also going to try blend it throughout the object. Honestly, we probably could have just used the texture and then gone into the remap here and just scaled this down. You can see it actually gives us pretty much the same result as the triplanar. But I usually like to use a triplanar, especially for more complex objects, because it's going to help to get you kind of clean UVs on corners, and just saves you UV unwrapping sometimes. So we've used a triplanar node, like I said, to just shrink that texture down. because you want the scaling to look realistic. If the texture's too big, the eye is going to catch that immediately, and you're going to realize that, you know, it's a fake image. The texture looks all off. That's not how a label would look like in real life. And actually, you have to go quite close to a label to really kind of capture those details. So that's why we have shrank the texture down. Now, if I was to plug that triplanar straight into the reflection roughness, and I'm actually going to take the bump out input off. I'm just going to remove that quickly. And I plug this into the surface with Shift Q again. And let's just zoom back in and turn on that render region. You can see we're starting to get some of that paper texture come through. You can see it in the reflections here. And you can also kind of just see it here where the highlight is. And actually, you know what, I will plug the bump back in, which I will talk about in a second. But you can see it's got quite a glossy finish to it, and realistically labels aren't that glossy. You can see it especially here from where the light is hitting it on the left hand side. It looks pretty glossy, and that's, like I said, not how a label would work. So we want to make it have a bit more of a matte finish, and the way we can do that is by using a ramp. So I just want to talk about how roughness works, or glossiness, when it comes to reflections and textures. So if I just showcase this texture real quick, it's got quite a dark grey finish to it. And basically, if we just had like a solid white color, that's going to be zero glossiness. So that's going to be a matte finish in terms of reflection. And if we had a black color, that's going to be completely glossy. So for example, if I got a color constant, set this to white, plug that into the reflection roughness, and then plug that into the surface, you can see we have a very matte finish. If I just kind of crop that down, you can see it's very matte. There's no glossiness to that whatsoever. You can still see the paper texture because we've got it plugged into the bump. But if I then change that color to black, this should give us a very glossy result. So let's turn that down. This is going to take a second to refresh. And now you can see we have a very glossy finish to our texture. So basically, like I said, at the moment, we have this gray paper texture, quite dark gray, which means it's on the glossier side. So we need to use a ramp to remap the colors of this texture to brighten it up, which we're doing using this ramp node here. So if I connected that to the surface, you can see we've brightened up that texture. We've clamped the black values a little bit. We've significantly increased the texture brightness by just bringing this white slider in. So now when we plug that into the reflection roughness and then plug that material into the surface, you can see the finish is much more matte compared to the previous darker texture we had, which was giving us a glossier result. So this ramp node is super powerful. I use it in pretty much all my textures, especially when it comes to actually loading textures like this in where I need to adjust the brightness. The ramp node is super helpful, and you can actually use this to recolor textures as well. But for a roughness map, we need to keep it black and white. So just increasing and kind of changing the positions of these points here, we can increase the brightness of the texture and give us a nice matte finish, which looks more realistic. So you can see as well, we're getting some really nice bump details in. And like I mentioned a minute ago, we're using a bump map here. So like I said, the paper texture comes with a normal map. So we've plugged that in. So that's the exact same paper texture, but just on a normal. Run this through a triplanar so that it matches the same size as the texture being used for the reflection roughness. And then we're just plugging that into a bump map, which is basically displacing the material. But a bump is a bit more subtle than displacement, a bit easier on the processing power, and is more for kind of smaller details. So you can see we have a really nice paper finish to this. And if I just disabled that bump, so if I just cut that line there, you're going to see we're going to lose a lot of detail because it's not catching those reflections on those bumps. You can see it is a little bit because obviously we have the texture plugged into the reflection roughness, but that bump is really helping to add another level of detail to that label. So I'm just going to undo that, and let's disable that render region and go to fit window. And like I said, because these details are quite small when it comes to an actual label, you're not going to pick up on them too easily when you're looking at the full image, but it is just a subtle detail to really help to increase that realism. And when we start to get a cleaner render from this, when we let it render out for a little bit, you'll start to see those paper details come through, and it's just a really nice kind of detail in there to help to increase the realism. So we've got our base label there. We've got a really strong starting point, but what we need to do now is start to add in those extra embossings and glossy finishes. So I'm going to run through this texture, and then I'm going to start to show you how you can actually set everything you need to set up in Photoshop. So our next material is going to be for the water droplet, and basically what we want for this is a super glossy material. So to start off, we have the same diffuse map plugged into the diffuse color, because obviously we want to pick up the color and the artwork as a starting point. But if we actually dive into the material, we have 0 roughness and we have an IOR of 3, which is closer to what a kind of aluminium chrome IOR would be. And basically the higher the number, the glossier the finish is going to be. So we could crank this all the way up to 10 and get a super bright glossy material, but 3 is a good enough amount to get some really nice results. So we've got that base texture plugged in, and we have then actually created a normal map for that drop. So this is going to be used to drive the embossing of this material. So if I plug this material into the surface, you can see that we're already getting that embossing on that water droplet there. But because it's a super glossy material, we're starting to pick up some gloss on the actual label itself. So by using this material blender, we're actually able to isolate this material. So like I said, we're stacking up these different materials, and then we're using textures to basically isolate each area of the label. So if I connected the material blender to the surface, and this is our final output, you can see we have our base texture, we're going to have our water droplet, and the way we've managed to isolate that super glossy finish just to that water droplet is through a alpha mask texture. So if I just connect that to the surface really quick, you can see we have a black and white mask here. So what's basically happening is we've plugged in this material into layer 1. So we have our base label plugged into the base layer. We have our super glossy water droplet plugged into layer 1, which if I just disconnected all these lines really quick, plug the material blender in, and let's enable layer 1 and just set it to white. So now we have layer 1, but it's got no mask to it. So it's basically multiplying it onto the base layer. So you can see we're getting the embossed water droplet, but now we've got that super glossy finish across the whole label because we have nothing to mask it out to that water droplet. So we're using this texture here, like I showed you a second ago, which is a black and white texture, and we're able to plug this into the material blender, and we want to affect layer 1 because that's our water droplet material, and we want to plug that into the blend color. So this is basically going to act as a mask for this material for layer 1 and allow us to just keep the glossiness in that area. So the way that alpha masks work is that anything that's white is going to be visible and anything that's black is going to be hidden. So if I now plug this material blender into the surface, now I do need to untick additive because basically that's still keeping it on multiply. You just want to untick that, which is going to leave you with the default diffuse color, and then just isolate this material using this alpha mask. So you can see how this starts to work. We now just need to create another alpha mask for the logo and then create another glossy material for the logo. Let's dive into Photoshop, and you can see we have the flat artwork which the client has provided, and this originally was provided in Illustrator, but I've brought it over into Photoshop, which is where I like to kind of set up my labels for Cinema 4D just because it's a little bit easier. Okay, so you can see we have a few different variants because there was a few different bottles I had to do, but this is the cucumber one, and you can see it's a smart object, which means it's going to actually link back to the original Illustrator artwork which they provided me. So it's going to load up Illustrator real quick, and I think we're going to be missing a few links, but I'm not going to get too worried about that, so let's ignore those. And basically this is going to allow me to kind of manipulate this label, and then it's going to update in Photoshop. So if I deleted this logo, saved it, and then go to Photoshop, it's going to update it, and because we're missing the links, it's going to remove those too. So I'm just going to undo that quickly. But you can see how we can start to kind of take different elements we need and use these to create masks. Now, the best way to do this is actually to right click on our diffuse layer, and go new smart object via copy, which basically means if I dive into this smart object, ignore those, dive into here, and if I was to delete this logo here, save this, go back into Photoshop, see it's missing from this layer, but then if I go back to the layer we had before, everything's still there. Whereas if I was to just duplicate it without making it a new smart object, and I updated this new layer, it's actually going to update the original one as well. So you just want to make sure you're doing that whenever you're making an adjustment to the smart object, unless you want them all to be linked. So this is our new smart object, and obviously you can see we're missing some of the links. Okay, so I'm going to dive back into that smart object. Let's just ignore all those, and let's just undo that so we have the logo back. So let's say we just want to isolate this logo because we need this to be used as the mask. So what I'm going to actually do is select everything, hold shift and click the logo to deselect it, and then we're also going to deselect the background layer. So now if I delete everything, we have the background white layer and we also have the logo layer. So if I save this now, it's updated in Photoshop, and now we just have the logo and a white layer. Now the reason why I keep the background layer is because if I deleted it, saved it, go into Photoshop, you can see it's going to reposition that logo to where it thinks the center is. Whereas if we keep that background layer in, it's still kind of treating this as the artboard, so it will keep that logo in place. And it doesn't really matter because then we can just get the magic wand tool, select part of the logo, and then go select similar, and then we could just create a mask. So we have something like that, which is basically how we're going to create this mask for the logo. So I'm going to press W on my keyboard, get the magic wand tool, select our logo, and then select similar, and then I'm just going to create a new layer, and let's just go edit, fill, and let's fill it with white. Hit OK, Control D to deselect, create a new layer below it and fill that with black. So now we have this white and black alpha mask, and pretty much we can just export this as a PNG. And you can see if I go into my texture folder, I've actually exported this already, and we have that black and white alpha mask for the logo, which is the same as the one I showed you a second ago with the water droplet. So you can create your alpha masks this way. So we have one for the logo, but if I wanted to go back to the original label, I could just right click, new smart object via copy, and do the same with the water droplet. So we've got the alpha mask for it. Now we need to create the normal map, which is what you're seeing here. This is going to allow us to create a bump map, which is going to give us the embossing we need, and really help to kind of dial in that extra level of detail. So the way we can do that is actually just select the white and black layers we've made, so the logo and the black background, and I'm going to duplicate these by pressing Ctrl J or Command J if you're on a Mac. Right click and convert to smart object, and if I go up to filter 3D and generate normal map, it's going to kind of do its thing, and you can see now it's created a normal map for us, and we get a lovely little preview here which I can scroll around. Hold on, it's a little bit temperamental. There we go. Showing us what the normal map looks like projected onto a sphere. So by default it's given us a blur of 2, but if I was to crank this up to something like 20, we're going to see it update here on our artboard, but also update in the little preview here. So you can kind of tweak with this until you get a right amount of blur. I'd probably go for something like 5 maybe, so we get some nice soft edges there, because if you actually look at most embossings, they do have quite a soft edge to them, and they are very, very subtle. So you don't want it to have a harsh edge, you do want it to have quite a nice soft finish to it. So we can hit OK on that. It's going to convert it to a normal map, and if for any reason you load it into Cinema and it is too soft or it's too harsh, because we converted it to a smart object, we can actually dive in here. It's going to open it back up, and we can tweak with the settings, adjust the blur, adjust the detail scale, and tweak that until you get a result that you're happy with. So now we can do the same, just export this as a PNG. You can see if I go into my texture folder, I have the logo normal here, and then also the mask. So now we have the alpha mask and the normal map. So you can basically do this with any part of the artwork that you need. Just isolate the areas in Illustrator, bring them into Photoshop, create a mask out of them, and then you can use that to create a normal map. So pretty quickly we've created a bunch of different textures to drive the bump and drive the alpha mask, which we can then bring into Cinema 4D. So we're going to dive back into there, and you can see where this is going. We're now going to do the exact same process with the logo. So we have a normal map created for the logo. Just make sure you enable the gamma override. Plug that into a bump, plug that into a material, and we're going to then plug that into the material blender. So if I just go up here, layer 2, layer color 2. So we're going to plug that in, and you can see by default nothing has happened, nothing's changed, and that's because when you don't have a texture plugged into the blend color, it's going to be set to black, which means nothing is happening. So we're going to take that same alpha mask, but this time for the logo, and plug that into the blend color 2. Now if we plug the material blender back in, we have that lovely embossed logo at the top. And that essentially is how I set up the label. So I'm going to run through the lights just to kind of finish off this video and show you how to really showcase these different finishes and get the best result from your label. So I'm quickly going to do a little setup here. So I'm going to lock the render view so I can jump out of the camera and still keep the camera in place here. And let's just go through the lights one by one. So we're going to start off with the background HDR, which we've actually excluded from the label. So it's affecting everything except the label, which allows us to get these really nice reflections on the bottle itself. I've then used basically a duplicate of that HDR, but this time including the label. I've adjusted the HDR a little bit so that the lighting's more focused in this middle bit here. And I've also turned down the exposure because when I used the same HDR as the background one, the label was overexposed, but the background wasn't. So I just had to separate them out into two separate ones. So this bottle HDR here, I've just bumped down the exposure so it doesn't blow the label out. And you can see already we're starting to pick up on some of these really nice details in the label. So if I just isolate this down here and zoom in, you can start to see how we're already picking up on that paper texture, which looks really nice. To kind of push this further, I have created some more lights. So let me just fit that back to the window. So we have this left label light here, which is just this big area light being used to brighten up the left hand side of the label. And you can see it's already starting to catch the reflections on the embossed logo, which is really nice. We're actually using a gradient here, which is from the Grayscale Gorilla Area Light Maps pack from the Grayscale Gorilla Plus membership. But to be honest, you can just add a shader graph and create a ramp in there. And the reason why we're doing this is just to give it a softer fall off, which just gives us kind of smoother lighting. I've then created the exact same light on the right hand side just to brighten up the right hand side of this label, but this time using a softbox. So we just get, again, some more detail into the actual light itself and helps to give us some softer results. The reason why I used that, I think, is because the gradient wasn't giving me the result I wanted. So I just tried a different image. Again, this is from the Area Light Maps Volume 2 from Grayscale Gorilla. I then have this light which is shining through the back wall here because I've actually added some translucency to this background here. So I can shine this light through the back, which is not only going to brighten up the background, but it's also going to help to inject some light into the liquid itself, just helping to brighten up the whole scene and the bottle as well. We're then going to add a fill light here, which is this big one on the right hand side, which is excluding the background and the label. So it's just being used to add this highlight to the glass itself. And this has a softbox texture on it, which has given us kind of like a bluish tone to it. Like I said in the last video, you want to mix some warmer and cooler tones in there. So we have a bit of a contrast between this right light and this left light to just add a little bit more detail. We then have this light shining through the bottom, which is brightening up this label inside. So it's literally this tiny area light here. If I can select it, there we go. It's just this tiny light shining through the bottom, which if I just disable quickly, you can see the label looks super dark inside. If I just turn it on, helps to just brighten it up. Just helps to give the scene a brighter feel to it. And I've actually turned down the spread on this so that it doesn't spread the light out onto the front label and solely just kind of shoots up through the middle there. And these last two lights, which I'm actually going to show you by themselves, are going to be to get the final finishes on this label. So you can see at the moment we're not really highlighting those really nice glossy finishes to the water droplet and to the logo. So the way to do that is to get some lights which are solely focusing on glossiness. So if I turn off all these lights and let's turn on this logo finish here, you can see in the settings of this light, if I go to Ray, you can see I've unticked Effects Diffuse. So this is purely just affecting specular, which is basically just the reflections. And I do just want to dive back into the label really quickly because I have added something to add another level of detail to this water droplet. You can see I have this ramp node here. If I connect this to the output, you can see it's fading from black to white here. So basically I'm using this to mask where the reflection is on this water droplet. So if I disable that node, you can see we've got a super harsh edge there. Whereas if I plug that into the reflection color, we're getting a softer fall off on that water droplet. So it just gives it kind of like a nice smooth glossy finish to it, just by using a horizontal ramp of black to white just to kind of fade out that glossiness and that reflection. So that's just a small little tip you can do there. And yeah, I then have an additional light set up the same way, just affecting specular to brighten up the left hand side of the logo here. So then when we turn on all the lights, this is the finished result. So you can see those final two lights are really helping to emphasize and highlight those finishes that we've created and really showcase all the hard work we've put into that material. So it is really important that you set up your lighting in a way that kind of showcases your label in the best way possible. So hopefully you guys found this tutorial helpful. Hopefully I kind of went over everything and explained it in a way that made sense. If you do have any questions, let me know in the comment section down below. I'm always happy to help out with any queries you may have. If you did find this video helpful, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell so you know when I next upload. I'm really trying to get back on this streak of uploading tutorials. I found it really motivating after posting the last video and it did so well, so I'm going to keep it up, do the best I can, pump out as much content as I can for you guys, and hopefully you guys find it helpful. And on that note, I'm going to stop waffling. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys, and I will catch you in the next video. All right, peace.